The earliest accounts of resurrection don't actually come from the Gospels. The Gospels, the canonical Gospels, were written Mark about 70 AD, Matthew about 80 AD, Luke about 90 AD, and John about 100 AD. 40 to 70 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. But there are much earlier accounts actually in the New Testament. And the oldest one perhaps is Paul's first letter to the Corinthians in chapter 15, where he speaks specifically about the occasions on which Jesus rose from the dead. And then he begins to exegete for himself what resurrection might mean. So reading from 1 Corinthians chapter 15. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received myself, that Christ Jesus died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all of the apostles, and last of all, as one untimely born, he appeared also to me. But some will ask, how are the dead raised? What kind of body do they have? You foolish person. What you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And what you sow is not the body that is to be, but a bare kernel, perhaps of wheat or some other grain. But God gives it a body as he has chosen, and to each kind of seed, its own body. For not all flesh is the same. There is one kind for humans, another kind for animals, another for birds, and another for fish. There are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but the glory of the heavenly is one kind, and the glory of the earthly is of another. There is one glory of the sun, and another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars. For stars differ from star to star in glory. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable. What is raised is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown as a natural body. It is raised as a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there's also a spiritual body. I tell you this, my brothers and sisters, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Words inspired by God. They were never the same afterwards. How could they be? They had seen planet Earth from 250,000 miles away. I'm talking about the American astronauts who landed on the moon beginning in July of 1969 and continuing. Every single one of them was changed. Some of them changed really radically. One of them, whom I knew personally, I got to meet him, was Edgar Mitchell, who was the 6th person to walk on the moon, and he was radically changed by the experience. Coming back from the moon particularly, as he looked out through the capsule window and saw, as it tumbled around in space, Earth coming and going on a regular basis, he had a total kind of an epiphany. He would never be the same again. And so as soon as he got back, he started thinking about human consciousness. And he founded an organization called the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is based in Petaluma, quite near to where I live. And he wanted to research consciousness in all its particularities, all the way from physics to mysticism. And at one stage, he commissioned 2 very well-known Catholic priest scholars, one of whom I actually got to know as well, Brother David Stendhal-Rast, a Benedictine monk, a Trappist monk, for a while was the scholar in residence down at Esalen Institute in Big Sur, and I got to meet him there on a few occasions. And Brother David is next door. He's of Austrian origin, a brilliant, brilliant man and a deep mystic. And a second one was a guy called Father Francis Tiso, who's now a professor in the Gregorian University in Rome. And Father Francis Tiso calls himself a disciple of Brother David Stendhal-Rast. He was hugely influenced by Brother David. And these 2 extraordinary scholars were commissioned by Edgar Mitchell to go to Tibet to study a phenomenon called the rainbow body. Now, Father Francis has a PhD from Columbia University in Tibetan studies and has traveled all over Asia. And they were sent to investigate this phenomenon called the rainbow body, a belief system in Tibetan Buddhism that some great Rinpoche, some great avatar figures, physical figures, when they come to die, they literally sit down in meditation and they let go of the soul. And over the course of the next few days, their physical body literally disintegrates. It's not buried. It's not even moved. It disintegrates and it becomes literally a rainbow emanating colors until finally nothing is left. On some occasions, they claim, on some occasions, the hair and the teeth are left and nothing else is left. And Father Francis was sent to investigate this on the ground and to talk about people who had witnessed this happening. And he came across one group of people in 1998 who had witnessed this happening to one of their own Rinpoches. And you can go online and check out what he says about it. And Father Francis was totally convinced of the authenticity of these claims, that these extraordinary enlightened beings could literally dissolve their physical corporeality into literally rainbow light. And he went on to compare that with the resurrection accounts of Jesus and the Shroud of Turin. And so that's what I want to talk about today. And today will just be the first part of a 2 homilies dissertation on resurrection. I'll continue with this next Sunday with God's help. And then on the third Sunday, I'll recap the 2 previous homilies and it'll open up to question and answer discussion. But for today's homily, I'm going to focus on 5 aspects of resurrection. Firstly, I want to talk about the notion of the empty tomb. Then secondly, how did the apostles deal with the objections that came to the fact that Jesus could have risen from the dead? Thirdly, I'm going to look at what precisely rose from the dead. Fourthly, I'm going to look at how many appearances and where did he appear after his resurrection. And then fifthly, I'm going to look at the Greek verb which is used in the New Testament to speak about appearances. What does this actual verb tell us about the resurrection? So they're the 5 points I'll make in today's homily, and then I'll continue with it next Sunday with God's help. So firstly, the empty tomb. All 4 Gospels teach us that the tomb was empty on Easter Sunday morning. There's not an iota of evidence in the New Testament that any Christian thought that the body of Jesus was still in a grave corrupting. There's not an iota of evidence that any of the Christians believed that to be the case. They're all convinced that the tomb was empty on the Sunday morning. Now, it could have been empty for a variety of reasons. So, for instance, the beautiful account that we just heard read, by Margaret this morning from John chapter 20, Magdalene is convinced that it's empty because somebody has taken the body away. And when she encounters Jesus, her eyes are filled with tears. The son is behind him. She doesn't recognize him. She thinks he's the gardener. And she thinks maybe the gardener took the body away and put it someplace else. So the tomb is empty as far as Magdalene is concerned initially because they took the body away. There's another idea that, the disciples of Jesus schlepped the body away in order to make the kind of claim that he had risen from the dead, and they had to deal with this. So the tomb could have been empty for a variety of reasons. Firstly, that, the gardener took it away to put it elsewhere, or that the disciples arranged a kind of a hoax to try to convince other people that Jesus really was the Mashiach and that he had risen from the dead. Now, it's interesting, nobody saw him actually rising from the dead. So the post-resurrection appearances have to do with, how he chose to reveal himself, but nobody actually saw it happening. But there's not an iota of evidence that the first Christians believed that the body of Jesus continued to lie someplace and corrupted. So that's the first thing. The empty tomb is hugely important, even though nobody saw him actually rising from the dead. So the second question I want to look at then is, how do they then deal with the objections, to the fact that, okay, we can agree there's an empty tomb, but there's lots of reasons why it could be empty. So how did they deal with those kinds of objections? Now, the canonical Gospels, as I said, are written 30, 40, 15, 60 years after the fact. And so they're now trying to accommodate the objections of the non-believers as they write these accounts of the resurrection. So, for instance, the objection that it was the disciples who removed the body in order to make the claim that Jesus was the Mashiach and had risen from the dead as he had predicted. So how do they respond to this? They say that, well, it was the women who discovered the empty tomb first. And obviously, women are not going to take a dead body and schlep it off someplace else and bury it someplace. And moreover, when the men were told by the women that the tomb was empty, they didn't believe them. So not only did we not take the body and hide it elsewhere, it was the women who discovered it. And when they told us, we didn't even believe them. So that was the first objection overcome. And then the notion, you're hallucinating. These post-resurrection appearances you're claiming to have, it's a hallucination. You're off your mind. What are you smoking, guys? You're hallucinating. So then they come up with two different classes of responses to these. And I call them the before-after responses and the below-above responses. So the before-after is they're trying to convince people it really is the same Jesus that we knew before he died. It was really he whom we encountered after the resurrection. And so how do we prove it to you? Well, for instance, when he came to us in the inner room and we thought it was a ghost ourselves, we thought we were hallucinating ourselves. And he said to us, Shalom Aleichem, peace be with you. Have you anything here to eat? And they're shocked. And they were eating fish. And so they gave him a bit of fish and he ate the fish. And so they're saying, how could a ghost eat fish? So obviously it was really he. And on another occasion, when they're up there in the upper room and Jesus appears to them, but Thomas isn't with them. And when Thomas comes later, they say, he came, we saw him, we met him, he was here, he was right here. And Thomas says, give me a break. And said, no, he was really here. And so the next week, they were together again, and Jesus appears, and Thomas is with them this time. And then Thomas said, oh my God, my Lord and my God. And there's a very famous phrase that is actually the first homily I ever gave in Swahili in Easter of 1973. I took the phrase in Swahili. It says, Heri wale wanao sadiki pasipo kuona. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. So Thomas could not believe until he saw with his own eyes. So Jesus says, no. I'm going to convince you. Take your finger and put your finger into the nail marks. Now take your fist and put it into the spear mark in my side. And Thomas says, my Lord and my God. And Jesus responds, Heri wale wanao sadiki pasipo kuona. Blessed are those who haven't seen and yet believed, that their faith and their trust was so strong. So here's more evidence that, we actually physically touched him. Thomas put his fingers actually into the nail marks and his fist into the side where the spear had pierced. So this I call the before-after. So they're trying to counter the objections that, it wasn't really the same guy. It was somebody else whom they mistook for Jesus. So there's this continuity of the life, the incarnated life of this extraordinary man, Jesus of Nazareth. Now, that's the advantage then of this, before-after images. It shows the continuity that proved that it was the same guy before and after death and resurrection. The disadvantages of this is that it doesn't say anything about the nature of post-resurrected life. So now they come with a bunch of different kinds of arguments against the objections. I call them the below above. And that is to show that although it was the same Jesus, it really was he, there was something radically different. There was a transformation. There was an elevation of consciousness in somewhere. So he could literally appear in rooms. He could pass through doors, even locked doors, not just doors which are just closed, but locked doors. He could come in through the locked doors. He could appear or disappear, manifest or demanifest at will. And even when he appeared, sometimes he could disguise his appearance, like with the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, with whom he had a lengthy conversation lasting over an hour, and they still didn't recognize who he was. So he could disguise his appearance. So they're trying to emphasize that it really was the same Jesus before and after, but there was also something radically different. There had been a transformation. And this is to show the difference between resurrection and mere resuscitation of a corpse. We know that in Jesus' own public ministry, on 3 different occasions, he raised people from the dead. There's the widow's son at Nain. There's the daughter of Jairus, and then there's his friend Lazarus, whom he raised from the dead. But it was a resuscitation. It wasn't a resurrection. All of these 3 had to die again. In fact, there's an account in the Hebrew scriptures that the prophet Elisha, who was a disciple of the prophet Elijah, that Elisha had raised the son of a Shunammite woman who was dead, and by lying on the child's body 7 times and breathing on him, he brought the child back to life. But that was resuscitation. You get the same thing in the Acts of the Apostles. St. Peter raised a woman from the dead. There was a woman, I think it was Tabitha was her name, who had died, a young convert to Christianity, and people are mourning her, and Peter goes into the room and he prays over this woman and she rises from the dead. But again, all of these accounts from Elisha and Peter, from the widow's son of Nain, and for Jairus' daughter, and for Lazarus, it wasn't a resurrection. It was a resuscitation. They came back to life and they had to die again. In the case of Jesus, it wasn't a resuscitation. It wasn't that he had a near-death experience and he came back and now is exactly the same and continues, as he was previously. It's a totally different transformational experience. So that's what I want to say about dealing with the objections. That's how they dealt with them in the earliest Christian writings. The most important question, however, is not so much the issue of bodily resurrection as it is the nature of the risen body. When you talk about Christ's body rising from the dead, what is the nature of that risen body? Now, I want to do a little kind of a look at world history here. In Egyptian cosmology, there are two levels to the body. They call it Ka and Ba. Ba is the physical body, that with senses that people can touch, and bump into. And Ka is the less dense body. It's more like the energy template out of which the physical body is a kind of a printout. It's like an online program. So you got it on your computer and you can read it on your computer. But if you want hard copy, you got to send it through a printer. And so that one is kind of the printed version and the other one is the online version. That was kind of an Egyptian model of body, two levels of body. Zoroastrianism had the very same notion. Zoroastrianism, which was the ancient religion of Persia, believed in what they called the Fravashi. And the Fravashi was also the energy template out of which the physical body would emerge. So in many, many different systems, there are much more sophisticated notions of body than what we have in the West. And when we're reading Paul's accounts, particularly in his first letter to the Corinthians, in chapter 15, where he's talking about resurrection, and in fact, in chapter 11 of the same letter, where he's talking about Eucharist, unless you understand that Paul is using three different words for body, you don't understand what he's saying about Eucharist, and you can't understand what he's saying about resurrection. Because the Greeks had three words for body: sarx, soma, and pneuma. Sarx means this flesh and blood stuff. Soma means the kind of the psychic body, the energy body, and pneuma means the spirit body or the soul or the essence itself. Now, Paul is talking then about, when he talks about resurrection, he says very definitely, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. The word he's using here for flesh and blood is the word sarx. And so he's saying that it is not the physical body that goes to heaven. Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. We're not talking about sarx here. We're talking about either soma or we're talking about pneuma. And that's why he's at pains to use these beautiful allegories of, what is sown and what rises are very, very different. When you plant an ugly bulb in the ground and then 6 weeks later you see an elegant daffodil, you could never have inferred from the ugly bulb that this extraordinary thing would emerge. So what is sown and what arises are very, very different. What is sown is sarx. What arises is either soma or pneuma. So in order to understand Paul's teaching, we have to learn, to differentiate between these meanings of body. And it is not that the physical body is the most real. It's actually the least real. It's the densest part of the illusion. A much realer body is the etheric or the astral or the psychic or the soul. These are much more real levels of body than merely the flesh and blood. So it's important that we understand that. Now, the Egyptians got that, the Persians got that, Paul got that, the Greeks got that, but nobody got it like Hinduism got it. So the Indian model of body that I've run by you many, many times is that the body exists at least 7 different levels. And the chakras kind of step the energy from one level of body to the other, like transforming stations. It's like if you go to Europe and you want to plug in your hair dryer, you're going to blow the circuits because they're operating on 240 volts, where here we're operating on 120 volts. So you blow the system unless there were transforming stations. So the chakras are like these transforming stations that step the energy between different frequencies of body. And the grossest level, they call it the gross body actually, when we die, it merely gets recycled as our molecular structure. Our atomic, molecular being gets recycled. It becomes food from other animals and for the birds of the air or for the worms in the ground, whatever. It just gets recycled. On the death of the physical body, according to Hinduism, the subtle body is released, and it's kind of an energy template. It looks like it. It looks like a drawing of the human body, but it's pure energy. And that has to die as well after several days. Firstly, the physical body dies. The etheric body hangs around for several days, maybe to attend its own funeral. And then that too gets recycled, as pure energy, which is available for the entire cosmos, not as physical molecular structure, but as energy itself. There's a third level of the body they call the astral body. And we experience it in our emotional life. Emotions come from that level of ourselves. We experience it if we have out-of-body experiences. We experience it if we have near-death experiences. We experience it in our dreams. And according to Hinduism, it becomes the repository of all of the experiences of the incarnation just ended, to be picked up later when we reincarnate. That's the third level. The fourth level they call the mental body. And it's the place of ratiocination. It's the place in which we download all our great ideas. You have a great idea about something you want to do in your garden. Where does it come from? It comes from a level of yourself, a fourth level of yourself called the mental body. There's a fifth level they call the causal body, or sometimes they call it the psychic body, because it's the level at which we discover all our psychic abilities: clairaudience, clairsentience, clairvoyance, psychokinesis, telepathy, these kinds of things. And according to Hinduism, that becomes the master archives in which all of the experiences of all of the incarnations that your particular soul have had are archived. And when you come back in to reincarnate, you pick up all of that information and it gets hardwired into your personality. Even if you don't have conscious recall over it, it helps you become who you become in your next incarnation. That will be a fifth level. The sixth level they call Atman, or it's where abstract thought comes from. It is the truth behind all of the illusions. It is your soul self, where your physical body is like your role self. Your soul, is your soul self is Atma. And then finally there's Brahma, which is, ultimate Godhead, into which all souls finally merge, because all souls are merely holographic fractals of this unity consciousness. And so finally we merge into that, which is not a diminution of who we are. It is that we've transcended merely individual consciousness and become total unity consciousness. So there would be like, when you're talking then about what rose from the dead, here are the considerations you have to bear in mind. If we're caught in the Western model that this lump of flesh is just a unity, that is the totality, nothing else exists, you're talking about body, you're just talking about this flesh and blood, with its endocrine system and its immune system and its cardiovascular system and its musculoskeletal system, that's all there is. We can't understand resurrection if we're stuck in that mindset. If we can't go where Paul went, or we can't go where the Hindus go, then resurrection continues to be an anomaly, something we say we believe in, but we don't understand it, and therefore we can't really trust in it. So that's my third point. What rose from the dead? I'm going to look then at the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. Where, and how many times. So here I'm drawing obviously from Paul, particularly the first letter to the Corinthians, which is written about 54 CE, Common Era. Mark's Gospel written 70 AD, Matthew about 80 AD, Luke about 90 AD, and John about 100 AD. But yet typically when we think about how many times did Jesus appear and to whom did he appear after his resurrection? Most of us think, well, we know he appeared to Mary of Magdala and the women who came to anoint the body. And we know that he came in the upper room when Thomas wasn't there, and later when Thomas was there. And we know that he appeared to 7 disciples at on the Lake Tiberias when they were fishing. Oh yeah, and the two guys in the road to Emmaus. Most of us think that that's what it is. When you actually collate all of the lists, there's at least 14 different episodes where you talk about Christ appearing. And I'm just going to list them off for you very quickly. Firstly, he appeared to Cephas, which is Peter's name, according to Paul. Firstly, he appears to Peter, according to Paul's writings. Then he appears to the 12, second time. Then 500 brothers all at once, most of whom Paul says are still alive, though some have died. And then fourthly to James. And then fifthly to all the apostles. And then to Paul himself, number 6. And then to Magdalene, number 7. And then to the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, which would be number 8. And then to the 11 at table, number 9. And then to another Mary, who's not specified, number 10. And then to 11 disciples on the mountain in Galilee, not in Jerusalem anymore, but in Galilee. And then the disciples when Thomas isn't present, and then again when the disciples, when Thomas is present, and then finally the 7 disciples who were fishing at Lake Tiberias. So according to this, 14 different accounts of post-resurrection appearances. And the locations, Jerusalem for a bunch of them, a little village called Emmaus outside of Jerusalem, a mountain in Galilee, Lake Tiberias, and the road to Damascus, where Paul has his encounter with Jesus. So there are many actually more accounts of his resurrection appearances and locations of it. So it's not just the 3 or 4 that we normally think of. Obviously, this was happening on some kind of a regular basis in several different geographical locations. And finally, I want to look at the notion of what does appear mean? Now, the New Testament is written in Greek, so the verb that's used is very important. The Greek verb that's used means that he chose to make himself visible to. It wasn't that if everyone was looking, in a northerly direction and Jesus appeared, everybody who's looking in a northerly direction is going to see Jesus. It does not mean that. It means that somehow Jesus is taking the initiative. He's choosing to make himself visible. Now, a contemporary of Paul, a Jewish philosopher called Philo, Philo of Alexandria, he lived in Egypt, and he's speaking Greek, which was the language even of Egypt at that time, and a great Jewish philosopher. And he's writing about a vision that Abraham had of God in the Hebrew scriptures. And here's what Philo says, but he says, it was not Abraham who saw God. It was God who made himself visible to Abraham. So with this Greek verb, it's very, very different. It's not just there's an appearance and anybody looking in that direction is going to be able to see it. It is not that. It is that the person who's appearing is choosing to or to not make himself visible to some or to all. And so this very same Greek verb is used in all of the theophanies of God. Wherever you find an appearance of God in the Hebrew scriptures, when it's translated into Greek, the Greek word that's used always is that it's God who takes the initiative and that God chooses to make himself visible to whom he will and to be invisible to those whom he will not. And so, for instance, when you read the Transfiguration account in the Synoptic Gospels in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they're talking about Moses and Elijah appearing to Jesus, they're using exactly the same verb. It is not Jesus who's, looking and seeing where they are. It's that Moses and Elijah are choosing to make themselves visible to Jesus and to Peter and James and John. And when you look through Luke's gospel, which is written obviously in Greek, when the angels are seen by the shepherds, the same verb is used. It was the angels who chose to make themselves visible to the shepherds. It wasn't the shepherds were looking, in the heavens and all of a sudden, oh my God, look what's up there. The angels are choosing to make themselves visible to the shepherds. The very same thing in Gethsemane, the night before he dies, when finally Jesus has the mother of all panic attacks, so bad that he's sweating blood and wants out. He wants to, if this possible, can there be a different ending to this story? And finally says, thy will, not my will, be done. And then we're told that an angel came and ministered to him. But the Greek verb is exactly the same thing. The angel chose to make himself visible to Jesus. Now, the angels are there all the time. We are surrounded by angels. We're surrounded by light. But mostly we can't see it because we're not in the mindset where they can make themselves visible to us because we don't have that mindset. So what I want to do now is I want to just create a whole bunch of analogies. One of them I'm going to pick from Paul and some I'm going to make up myself to try to impress upon us that there's a part that we need to play as well in this. So it's not that God is being obstreperous and choosing to appear or not appear. God is choosing to appear to those who have the mindset and the soul set to be able to change their frequencies and see beyond mere visible spectrum or auditory spectrum. So I'm going to use a few examples here. So imagine I'm being invited to go down to Palo Alto and to meet a friend of mine whom I haven't seen for a few years since the lockdown. And he's staying in a hotel in Palo Alto on the 5th floor. And the restaurant is on the lobby. And the parking area is down underneath, several stories underneath. And I drive down and I park my car away down several stories down. And I phone him, I tell him I'm here. He has to come down from the 5th floor to the lobby to meet me. And I've got to come up from the basement in order to meet him. That is what has to happen in an encounter with the divine. There is an ability on the part of the disincarnate to lower their vibration, to come down from the 5th floor to the lobby, but also it demands that we come up from the underground parking in order to get as far as the lobby in order that we can have a meal together. So that's the first image I want to look at. It depends on both of us. They can only come so far. Unless we're prepared to go some of the journey, the encounters are not going to happen. I'm going to take up this Paul's beautiful image again. If you'd had no knowledge of flora, if you'd never seen vegetation in your life, you could never infer a golden daffodil from the ugly bulb that you planted several weeks before. You could not infer it if you had not seen it happen. If in your mind somewhere there wasn't the possibility of the realization that this ugly thing which I'm planting and covering with dirt is going to become this extraordinary, elegant yellow flower. Nor could you infer, the existence of an oak tree, an elegant oak tree, from the presence of a tiny acorn. You could not infer it. There is no way you could make the leap between this tiny little thing and this extraordinary, magnificent oak tree, unless you had some previous knowledge that this were indeed possible. So in the same sense, without a mystical sense, you could never infer, spirit from mere matter. If you didn't have a mystical sense yourself, you could never infer the reality of spirit from the existence of mere matter. Nor could you infer the existence of the soul from the experience of the ego. If all you have is an ego and you're identified with the ego, there is no way you could infer the existence of your own soul, your own essence, by merely focusing upon this ego. So trying to measure the reality of resurrection, by using the senses is like trying to measure IQ with the weighing scales. It is totally inadequate to the task. Or to use another analogy, all of us can read, thanks be to God. You imagine an alphabet employed in writing a book is just basically a series of squiggles of ink on a piece of paper. But these squiggles are letters that become symbols to communicate non-physical messages to us, like the plot or the storyline. But if you didn't know how to read, you'd just be looking at a bunch of just squiggles, black ink on a white page. You could not infer a storyline from that unless you had to transcend your sensorium and go to a totally different level of yourself where you're able to convert physical symbols into mental images. And it's the very, very same thing. The physical objects which we encounter in our everyday lives are sacramentals that contain at their core pure spirit, as it reveals to us the storyline of incarnation. So everything you encounter, is a message from the divine. But if we don't know how to look, life is just a jumble of stuff and events. We have to be able to make the leap. And that leap is because we've practiced being in other spaces. And so the most mystical revelation you'll ever encounter is the ordinary present moment seen through the resurrected eyes of the awakened soul. Everything around you is symbolic of resurrection. Everything around you sings of spirit, but you can only encounter that, you can only hear that, and you can only see that, and you can only feel that if you awaken the resurrected sensorium of your own soul self. And it's in that sense, then, I want to end by talking about this rainbow body, because for me, the rainbow body and the shroud of Turin, of which I spoke, I think last year or the year before, are synonyms. I've said to you many, many times that it is a scientific fact that all matter is simply frozen light. All matter. I don't care what it is, whether it's the chair on which you're sitting, whether it's the door, to the outside, whether it's your own physicality, all matter is simply frozen light. And it is the soul that gives morphology to that lump of matter. One soul is going to create a daffodil out of that matter. Another soul is going to create an elephant out of that matter. Another soul is going to create a human being out of that matter. And so it's the logos or the soul that takes the frozen light and gives a particular form to it. So I see no reason whatsoever why an enlightened being could not release the light of the matter of which he is composed and literally radiate the surroundings in such a way that he appears like a rainbow body or imprints the inside of a piece of linen with the evidence of the physical body it once contained. The question for me today on this Easter Sunday, again, as Joan Chichester said so beautifully, it is not so much about belief in the resurrected body of Jesus Christ, although I totally understand and I totally believe that it is true. What is much more important is, how can you and I release the frozen light of which we are physically composed in order to reconnect with our own divinity? And even more importantly, how can we release the light hidden within Pachamama, planet Earth, and all its denizens, whether they're human beings or fireflies? How can we release the light hidden within the reality of life on planet Earth in order to experience resurrection of our times and of our world? That is my prayer on this Easter Sunday of 2021, that you have the courage in your own life to release the light of which you're composed, so that you rediscover who you really are and not get mixed up with the kind of the spacesuit that you're inhabiting, and that you can look around you at the world we possess and begin to see the frozen light hidden in everybody and everything, so that you can help resurrect and release the light, so that there be a radical transformation of Christ consciousness in your life and my life, in our world and in our times. Namaste.